The BMI Podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast. Today, we're going to discuss some additional drugs. We've discussed the GLP-1s, which are clearly the industry-leading medication currently, but there are some people that don't do well on those. We've also discussed the medicine Contrave, or the naltrexone and bupropion combination medication. So today I'm going to discuss Phentermine, Phentermine-Topiramate, and Orlistat. It'll be relatively short, but I think these are three different medications that ought to be addressed. Phentermine is an extremely common worldwide medication. They do have some role in weight loss. They're less effective and they have some potential side effects that really you'd want to guard against. But I think it's worth a discussion. So let's talk about Phentermine. The trade name in the U.S. is called Adipex, and it's a weight loss drug. It's been around since 1959. It's very similar to amphetamines. You see people that are on methamphetamines, and they're markedly skinny as a general rule. Not all of them, but most of them are. And that is one way to lose weight, but I definitely don't recommend it. But Phentermine is a prescription medication that is very similar to amphetamines. It's a stimulant, and it's also a controlled substance, and it can be addictive, and there's a lot of potential for abuse. How does it work? Well, it's an anorexic drug. Remember, on the previous podcast, we talked about the anorexic pathway and the orexigenic pathway. So the anorexic pathway decreases appetite and increases energy expenditure. And the orexigenic pathway increases appetite and decreases energy expenditure. So one is very helpful for gaining weight and the other is helpful for losing weight. And it's all regulated through our brain. And remember, we talked about the fundus of the stomach. The top of the stomach releases an enzyme called ghrelin, which is orexigenic. And then the fat cells release a drug called leptin, which can be anorexigenic. So you don't have to remember this, but it is an anorexigenic drug, meaning that it decreases appetite and increases energy expenditure. So very similar to the previous drug that we discussed, this drug works in the hypothalamus of the brain. In Phentermine, it suppresses the appetite by stimulating the release of norepinephrine. Remember that norepinephrine is one of the hormones or neurotransmitters that we discussed when we were talking about Contrave, the last medication. And Phentermine stimulates the release of norepinephrine in the brain, but it also inhibits the reuptake. So remember before we talked about if you had an extension cord and it was plugged in, and let's just say you cut it. You just took a pair of scissors and you cut it, and you separated the two ends of the cut extension cord by just a small little amount. Right? But the wires were exposed and you had it plugged in. Then as that electricity would travel down, it would arc across that little gap, right? And that little gap and where it arced across is kind of like what our brain has, right? You have all these neurons and you have these little gaps that are called the synaptic clefts or the synapses. And so what happens is these neurotransmitters get released and they sort of reside there, at least temporarily, in these little gaps between the neurons and these synaptic clefts. And so then if you inhibit their reuptake, that allows the chemicals to stay in that area and you get a sustained benefit from that hormone or that neurotransmitter. Let's just talk a little bit about medicines like Zoloft or Prozac, right? Those are what we call selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That deals with serotonin. And so the serotonin that is in those little synaptic clefts, by taking those medications, you're selectively actually inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin for that. So you get a sustained effect from the serotonin by it sort of hanging out there in that synaptic cleft for a longer period of time. With Phentermine, it releases norepinephrine primarily. Interestingly, it also releases dopamine and serotonin to a much lower effect, right? So the dopamine and the serotonin are released when you take Phentermine, but much less than the norepinephrine is stimulated to release. So the norepinephrine, it's a stimulant, and then it ultimately causes some appetite suppression. And remember, dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with reward. And then serotonin is a mood-altering enzyme. In addition to phentermine stimulating the release of norepinephrine and then to a much lesser extent dopamine and serotonin, it also simultaneously inhibits the reuptake. So it increases the release of these enzymes and then it inhibits their uptake. So not only do you have an increased release, but then a sustained release, so to speak. So that's the general mechanism of action for phentermine. It suppresses the appetite by releasing these enzymes. For those of you that are old enough, there was a medication called Fen-Phen. It was wildly popular in the 1990s. It was actually phentermine in combination with another medication called Fenfluramine or dexfenfluramine. And that medication also was an anorectic medication. But what happened was it was a very potent stimulator of serotonin. So much so that there was so much serotonin that ultimately what led to is a lot of cases. In fact, I think it's been estimated that maybe as many as 7 in 100,000 patients that were on it developed pulmonary hypertension and heart valve disease. And some of these were fatal. And so they ended up taking that component off. But interestingly, the phentermine component did not show any significant deleterious effects or fatal effects. So it remained on the market as a standalone drug. It was initially a standalone drug. And actually, fenfluramine was a standalone drug as well. And then at one point they combined them. It wasn't the combination that caused the problem. It was the fenfluramine alone that caused the problem. So that has been taken off the market. So now you can get phentermine alone as Adipex. There's also a combination drug where phentermine is combined with topiramate, which is actually a seizure medicine. Now, I bring that up and I'm going to talk a little bit about that medication. They're very similar. Obviously, the active ingredient in phentermine is the same. It just has the added benefit of having the topiramate. But I bring that up just for one, so that if you recall the Fen-Phen being fatal, I'm not discussing that drug. I'm just talking about phentermine. And then also, I think it's important to recognize that Fen-Phen is different than the Phentermine-Topiramate medication. So phentermine alone is called Adipex, and phentermine in combination with topiramate is called Qsymia. And again, the phentermine component works in the exact same way because it is actually the same drug. But the topiramate combination actually leads to an increase in satiety. So the phentermine component decreases your appetite, just as we discussed when we talked about phentermine alone. But then the topiramate gives you a feeling of being full, or gives you a feeling of being satisfied, adequately full. Not necessarily overly full, like on Thanksgiving, but just adequately full where you don't have the desire to eat more. It's thought that this probably works on the GABA receptors in the brain, and it also is known to increase the dopamine, which again, the dopamine is part of the reward center, which makes you feel good. What is known is that the exact mechanism of the satiety component of topiramate is not really well understood, but it's thought to work on this GABA receptor and increase dopamine. So the two drugs are very similar. Obviously, they have phentermine involved in both of them. So it's important to recognize who should and shouldn't necessarily be on these medications. Let me just talk about it. When you have a stimulant drug like phentermine, that stimulates the CNS, the central nervous system. And so that's going to do a lot of things. It's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase your blood pressure. And so if you have a history of hypertension or a racing heart or a hyperactive thyroid, a thyroid that overacts, or if you have glaucoma or significant coronary artery disease, this drug's really contraindicated. Another reason that you don't want to take it is if you've been on an antidepressant in the class of an MAOI inhibitor, so a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. If you've been on one of those, you need to be off of it for at least 2 weeks before you go on this. And then, of course, if you have a history of drug abuse or addictive behavior, this is not the right drug for you. Side effects are all really in line with the mechanism of action. So palpitations, heart racing, strokes, chest pain, actually heart attacks, restlessness, insomnia, tremor, all of these can be associated with phentermine and phentermine with topiramate. Also the side effect of nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, and sometimes constipation. It's interesting, almost all medications have a fair component of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation. All of these things kind of tend to be present in most medications, but no different with these. Now, another thing that's important to recognize is both phentermine and phentermine with topiramate are both what we call pregnancy category X, meaning you absolutely should not take them when you're pregnant or breastfeeding. And in fact, if you do, it's ideal if your physician does a pregnancy test before he prescribes it and then probably has you take one on a monthly basis just in case you get pregnant. So what's the difference between phentermine alone and phentermine with topiramate other than the biochemical differences that I just described? Well, it looks like phentermine with topiramate may be a little more effective. The average weight loss with phentermine alone is about 3 to 8%. And it looks like Phentermine-Topiramate leads to weight loss of about 7 to 11%. Now, on both these medications, if you've been on them for about 3 months and you haven't had at least 3% body weight loss, it's worth coming off. The other thing that's noteworthy is that you just generally feel better when you're on this. It is a stimulant, so you've got, enhanced norepinephrine circulating throughout your system, right? Norepinephrine is very similar to adrenaline. So you have this enhanced energy. You have increased levels of dopamine, which remember is the reward neurotransmitter, and you have increased levels of serotonin, which helps to regulate your mood. So it's easy to become addicted to these because you just generally feel better when you're on it. And then, of course, if you also have the added benefit of losing weight, you can see where people get somewhat addicted to them, even if they're not physiologically addicted. They like the way it feels and they like the effects of it. The reasons that you go on them, of course, is if you're obese, a BMI of 30 or greater, or a BMI of 27 or greater with at least one obesity-related comorbidity. These indications are really the same for almost all of the medications. It's been shown that about 80% of people that have been on this for 6 months do, in fact, have an approximate 5% weight loss. Now, of course, this is in combination with diet and exercise. So, like all the medications that I've talked about, you don't want to go on these medications and just continue your bad habits, right? All of these medications, whether it's the GLP-1s, Contrave, Phentermine-Topiramate, those are respectively known as Adipex and Qsymia. If you're just going to take the medication and not make the lifestyle modifications, you're not really gaining any ground. Yes, you'll lose some weight, but as soon as you come off of those medications, that weight's going to go back on. So you need to think of all these medications as a bridge to help you get from where you're at to where you need to be in terms of not only weight, but just in terms of general lifestyle and healthy choice making. It's generally regarded that you should only be on these medications for approximately 6 months. Now, oftentimes patients are on them longer. Since there is such a potential for abuse, it's not a great option for a long-term treatment. It is worth noting that you should take these medications in the morning. If you take them at night, it's likely to cause some insomnia, which is going to alter all sorts of levels, including your cortisol level. And we know that people who sleep better actually have better weight control. So you don't want to take this medication at night and then be up all night or have a problem sleeping, get all your hormones out of whack from lack of sleep, and then working against you in terms of weight loss. So that's generally the overview on Phentermine and Phentermine-Topiramate, also known as Adipex and Qsymia, respectively. Now, let me just briefly talk about one other drug, and then we'll get off of the drugs for a while on the podcast. So the last drug I'm going to talk about is a drug called Orlistat, O-R-L-I-S-T-A-T, Orlistat. You can get a version of this over the counter called Alli. The mechanism of action for this drug is it inhibits lipase. So lipase is secreted from various reasons, but mainly your pancreas, which then it helps to break down fats so that they can be absorbed. So you take in dietary fats and the lipase breaks the triglycerides down into free fatty acids, which then are absorbed. If you inhibit lipase, you inhibit that breakdown. And so the fats then just sort of work through your body and you end up going to the bathroom and just pooping out a lot of fat. That's actually called steatorrhea. Steatorrhea is like diarrhea, but it's with fat. So if you have this, then you're literally pooping out a bunch of fat. You're just sort of bypassing the gut and not absorbing the fat. And that's important in that, if you're taking in a ton of calories from fat, that will help you to decrease your caloric intake. But remember, we've talked about it. Fat isn't really the problem in terms of the macronutrient, right? Carbohydrates are really the problem. But if you're just globally looking to decrease your energy intake or your caloric intake, this is one way that will help you to decrease it, right? I mean, you're taking it in just the same, but you're not absorbing it and you're just passing it. You're just pooping it out. Now, what are the side effects? Well, the side effects are if you have significant diarrhea, particularly steatorrhea, and you don't have good sphincter control, you can sure shart your pants a whole lot, right? There can be a lot of problems with incontinence, maybe not just full-on incontinence, but that's a big problem. Doesn't matter how skinny you are, right? You can get yourself looking good, but if you're crapping your pants all the time, it kind of defeats the purpose. So there's one side effect. The other thing is there are fat-soluble vitamins that you have, particularly vitamins A, D, E, and K. Vitamins A, D, E, and K. Those are fat-soluble vitamins. So if you're on a medication that inhibits lipase, which in turn inhibits fat absorption, you can become vitamin A, D, E, or K deficient over time. It does work effectively to decrease caloric intake. Remember, Fat itself has 9 calories per gram as opposed to protein and carbohydrate each only have about 4. So it is a good way to decrease caloric intake or decrease caloric absorption, which ultimately is kind of the name of the game. There is a prescription version called Orlistat, and then there is an over-the-counter version called Alli. The only real side effect with this, other than the diarrhea, is just the fact that it can cause some issues with other medication absorption. So if you're on a blood thinner, sometimes that can cause some problems if you're not absorbing it well. But also if you're not absorbing vitamin K, that can cause some issues with your blood coagulation and thinning. So be sure you talk with your physician on that. But Orlistat is a reasonable choice for some weight loss, usually about 5 to 10% weight loss, again, coupled with diet and exercise. This isn't something that you necessarily want to be on long-term either, right? The goal, of course, is to lose weight, but it's to do that hopefully by making modifications to your diet and your lifestyle. And so getting from where you're at to where you want to be, these medications or any of the medications that we've discussed serve as a good role to kind of help get you there. So hopefully this has been informative in terms of 3 additional medications for weight loss. We'll pivot somewhat on the next few podcasts, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about the healthy lifestyles. We've talked a lot about diet and exercise, goal setting, various medications, and really have focused on the obesity component, which is really what I'm passionate about. But the healthy lifestyle component also is a major part of it. And really, to be honest with you, it's kind of a more exciting part. It's a more fun part and something that we'll just kind of start to dive into. So we'll start to work our way into that. But if you have any questions on this, please feel free to contact me. Go to our website, thebmipodcast.com, and we're happy to get back to you. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.